Hello everyone, this is Tapasya and welcome back to our channel #literature with us. And in this today's video, we are going to learn history of English literature, of course, for the beginners to know a new history of English literature on the Neoclassical period. Now, if we go through Neoclassical period, we should remember that the earlier period that we have learned was the Elizabethan age, and in that I have talked about the Puritan age. And then we spoke how literature, Elizabethan age came to an end. And then there was a rise of the Neoclassical period from 1660 to 1798. Now, this period between 1660 to 1798 is roughly marked as the neoclassical period in the history of English literature. Moreover, this time period is divided into two parts. The first one is the Restoration period or the Age of Dryden. The Age of Dryden is again from 1660 to 1700. And the Classical Age or the Augustine Age, you could call it, or you could say it's the 18th century. Now, this classical age is further divided into two distinct periods. The first one is the Age of Pope from 1700 to 1744, and the Age of Johnson from 1744 to 1784. Let's learn it slowly and steadily, going through one of the each sub ages of it. The first one is the Restoration period, that was from 1660 to 1700. Now, this period from 1660 to 1700 is, of course, called the Restoration period because the monarchy was restored in England, and Charles II came back from England from his exile in France and became the king. Now, it is also known as the Age of Dryden. So, why is it known as the Age of Dryden? Because Dryden was the most significant literary figure of the age. The Puritans, who were previously controlling the countries, were finally defeated. So, as a result, a reaction was being launched between whatever they held sacred. All restraint and disciplines were casted away, and a tide of indecency and frivolity swept the country. Since Charles II and his followers had enjoyed a gay life during their exile in France, they introduced some foppery, or you could say looseness in England as well. As a result, you'll find that people were deprived of the old Elizabethan spirit with its patriotism, creative vigor, and the love of adventure and romance. Moreover, the Puritan spirits, with its moral discipline and love of liberty, also became a thing of the past. The writers of this period made two important contributions to English literature. The first was in the form of realism, and second was a tendency of preciseness. Okay. Now, if we come to the Restoration poetry, the Restoration poetry was mostly realistic and satiric. It was mostly written in the heroic couplet, of which Dryden was the greatest master. He was the most important figure of the Restoration period and made great uh, achievements in the fields of poetry, drama, and prose. In fact, he was the only poet of this age worth mentioning. Remember that. He wrote in a lucid and forceful style that laid the foundation of classical school of poetry in England. Furthermore, if you see, Dryden's poetry is divided into three groups. The first one is doctrinal poetry. Let me write it. The second is political satire. And the third is the fable. So these were three types of poetries which it was divided. And his famous political satire includes Absalom and Achitophels. Please remember the satire of Dryden and the Medal. And it's a really interesting one. You should go through it. And Dryden's famous doctrinal poem, you could say, are Religio Laici and the Hind and the Panther. Okay, here, if we talk about his fables that were being written, we shall come to know that those fables were written in the narrative forms, and it entitled him to rank among the best storytellers in the world in England. So Palamon and Archite was examined in this regard. That is the fable part. If you see Palamon and Archite, you could find it in fable. And Dryden's poetry displayed all characteristics of Restoration period and therefore thoroughly representing this particular age. If we talk about drama and prose now, Restoration drama showed entirely new trend due to the long break with the past, and it was extremely influenced by the new age that was deficient in poetic feelings, imaginations, and emotional approach to life. Rather, it focused on prose as a medium of expression and had a realistic, intellectual, and critical approach to human life and its problems. Now, the comedy of manners was the most famous form of drama during the Restoration period. Please do remember, during the Restoration period, comedy of manners. This was one of the important, you could say, dramas you could find in during this particular age, that is Restoration period. It portrayed, now what did this comedy of manners shows us? It portrayed the sophistical life of society, dominant classes, and insolence, gaiety, and intrigue and foppery. So the most popular restoration dramatist was, of course, William Congreve. Do you remember his name? With Comedy of Manners, there comes a name that is William Congreve. Okay, and you'll find that he wrote the best comedies. For instance, Love for Love, The Way of the World. Okay, and the chief writers of heroic tragedy was, of course, John Dryden. His famous tragic plays include Tyrannic Love, All for Love, and The Conquest of Granada. Now, if you see in this field of prose, the Restoration period held its head higher than poetry and drama. A unique prose style evolved from the first time, and this style could be used for the plain narrative, practical business, and argumentative expositions of intricate topics. So Dryden was the dominant leader and practitioner of that new prose style. So other famous prose writers of this period were John Bunyan, John Tillotson, William Temple, Thomas Pratt, and Viscount Halifax. Besides Dryden, John Bunyan was the greatest prose writer of that particular age, and his most famous work is The Pilgrim's Progress. Now, Let's move on to the next subtopic, that is the classical or the Augustine age of 18th century. So this one is called as the classical or Augustine age. This was the 18th century, which was it famously renowned with. Okay. Now, the 18th century in English literature is called the classical age, of course, or you could call it as Augustine age. Now, we also call it as age of reason or age of good sense. Remember that. So, the writer of the age produced works of great significance and merit. So, the major characteristics of Restoration period, that is precision and realism, were carried forward to further perfection. Now, it was during the 18th century that, for the first time in the history of English literature, prose occupied the front position. The most important features of 18th century was the origin and the development of the novel. And this new literary form, which at present hold a prominent place, was fed and nourished by the great masters such as Defoe, Richardson, Smollett, Fieldings, and others. And all these writers laid the secure foundations of this new form. Now, if I ask you who is the mother of English literature, we know who is the father of English literature, of course, but can you tell me who's the mother of English literature? So once you go through this particular video, you'll come to know who is the mother of English literature. Let's move on to the next subtopic, the Age of Pope. The Age of Pope, of course, comes under the Classical Age. And this is from 1700 to 1744. Remember that. Now, the earlier part of 18th century is called the Age of Pope. And since Alexander Pope was the dominating figure in that period, the poetry of Age of Pope is not of a high order. Still, it has some distinct merits, such as the creation of a technical, beautiful verse, the clarity of its expression, and the finished art of satire. Now, the famous poets of this age includes Alexander Pope, the greatest of all poets of this age, Matthew Prior, John Gay, Edward Young, and others. However, the greatest prose writers of this age were Daniel Defoe, Jonathan Swift, Joseph Addison, and Richard Steele. And the prose of this age exhibit the classical qualities, for instance, vigor, clarity, and direct statement. Now, if we talk about the age of Johnson, because it is again the part of classical age, the age of Johnson, which started after, or you could say through this particular age of Pope. So it is from 1744 to 1784. Okay, and the later half of Augustine age, you could say, was dominated by Dr. Samuel Johnson. Okay, it was Dr. Samuel Johnson, and is therefore called the Age of Johnson. So during this age, cracks had begun to appear in the edifice of classicism, and there were clear signs of revolt in favor of romantic spirit. It was especially noticeable in the field of poetry. So the poets were showed who showed romantic learnings in their poetry are the precursors of the romantic revivals. And these poets include James Thomson, William Blake, Thomas Gray, William Cowper, William Collins, and George Crabbe. So, due to its romantic inclination, we also call the Age of Johnson as the age of transition in English literature. The dominating prose writers of this age were Samuel Johnson, Edmund Burke, and Edward Gibbon. Now, they were indeed the pillars of Age of Johnson and represented in themselves in the highest achievements of uh, English prose. So, after the Age of Johnson came the Romantic period, and the Neoclassical period officially ended in 1798 with William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge after publishing Lyrical Ballad. So, Lyrical Ballad itself was being published in 1798, and here we stop with Neoclassical Age. And in the next lecture, we'll be starting with a new age, a new movement, which is the Romantic period. I hope you would have understood what exactly the Neoclassical Age is and how it is being subdivided. So that's all for this video. Thank you so much for listening to this video.